and gentlemen, welcome to the Film Fan Club Show. I'm Sam Carrico, and we've got a great show for you tonight. Hannah Searson is here to talk about Godzilla x Kong, the new Empire TM. But first, I want to make something clear, something that should go without saying, but I feel like it needs to be said. I refuse to be a shill, okay? We all saw Madam Web when it came out, right? Okay, maybe we didn't all go see Madam Web when it came out, but we remember when it came out. The reviews were not good. In fact, they were worse than the reviews for The Room. Although you wouldn't know that if you only followed one content creator.
Probably not going to do a video for this one, based off of what I've heard, since I do try to keep it mostly about film celebration on this channel.
That's Chris Stuckmann. He's a pretty successful YouTuber who's now taken a go at being a filmmaker. He's about to use that as his reasoning for not reviewing Madam Web. And look, film celebration is great. I love celebrating good movies. But knowing what makes a movie good also requires recognizing when a movie is bad and being able to tell the difference between the two, you feel me? But let's play some more of his video.
Having seen the film, I'm going to tell you that this is not a movie review of Madam Web. I am not about bashing filmmakers, artists.
I love that because it's clear what its real opinion is. We all know that if he did talk about it, he would speak negatively. He's found a way to let us know that, but still maintain a level of posterity. It's great. It feels silly at best and underhanded at worst.
I know how hard it is to make a movie. I do not know how hard it is to make a movie under the studio system. I was able to make an indie film without a giant corporation breathing down my neck.
Well, guess what, Buttercup? I do. I've made both. Indie films like Resurrection by Peyton Grufick, Closure, and Now We Pray, both from Anthony Fraser, as well as the hit film, the $200 million budgeted, mind you, Killers of the Flower Moon. And you know what helps both indie creators and studio collaborators alike? Constructive criticism. That's not even my main beef with his argument. There's a saying I like that's often attributed to George Orwell. I'm not really sure if he actually ever said it. Anyway, it goes, journalism is printing what someone else does not want published. Everything else is public relations. I am not in this for public relations. Not yet, anyway. I'm not here to shill for the movie industry. I'm here to inform my audience. If we're covering a movie and it is bad, it's my obligation to let you know, because it's important. We're at a time in movie history where there are more bad sequels, requels, and reboots than ever before, and we get more and more of these because people keep seeing them. How could we ever hope that people will stop supporting bad movies, though, if they don't know which movies to avoid in the first place? So when we talk about Godzilla x Kong, the new Empire TM today, know that whether I liked it or not, it's my true opinion. I'm not holding back just because it's a studio movie or because I don't know what I'm talking about. If we want to affect change, it starts by telling people how we really feel, even on April Fool's Day. All right, we've got a great show for you lined up. Let's welcome tonight's guest. And my guest today is a writer who really came on my radar whenever she wrote an article titled Force of Nature, What Godzilla Really Means. She came on the show to talk about Godzilla versus Kong, and we're happy to welcome back to talk about Godzilla x Kong, Hannah Searson. Welcome to the show, Hannah.
Hi, well, thanks for having me, Sam.
It's good to see you. And you know, Godzilla is always a fun thing to talk about, so it's good to have you for an occasion like this.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, but there have been a couple of other Godzilla products that have come out since Godzilla versus Kong in 2021. So I was going to ask just off the top if you've seen Godzilla -1 yet, and what do you think of that, and maybe a little bit about the different approaches, because it is a very different movie than this one. What do you think about the different approaches to Godzilla, if you've seen that?
Well, actually, funnily enough, I live in Hong Kong, and Toho has clearly had some distribution issues with East Asia. So Godzilla -1, I'm still waiting to see it. It still hasn't come out here yet, which is kind of infuriating given that it just won the Oscar and everything. But I'm trying to be good and not going for alternative means for accessing it at the moment. But it has been kind of weird that this thing that I'm massively passionate about, I've not actually been able to access.
That's gotta suck. And sure, kudos to you for sticking with the strictly legal means, you know, not sailing the high seas on that one. Have you seen the Monarch TV series? What do you think of that? I haven't seen it.
Yeah, I watched Monarch. I enjoyed it for the most part. I thought Kurt Russell and Wyatt Russell, they were a particular highlight. The 1940s storyline I thought was excellent and super fun, had a great episodic vibe to it each time. Um, some of the I think it's 2015, in which the modern storyline is set. Some of the characters in that one, I have to admit, were kind of infuriating, some of the humans. Um, but on the whole, I thought it was a good laugh. And also, it added to the lore with all of this stuff about the Hollow Earth and everything. And that was kind of exciting to see as well, I guess.
What do you think it is that makes the IP so versatile? Like you can do a pretty silly action romp, and then you can do a serious. I know you said you haven't seen
Yeah.
Minus One, but Minus One and Shin Godzilla were both much more serious
Oh,
takes.
yeah.
What do you think it is that makes a character like this so versatile?
Yeah, I think in many ways, this kind of goes into some of my thoughts onto GXK actually, in that um, Godzilla as a character and as a franchise over the last 70 years, because obviously it's the 70th anniversary this year, has had so many different iterations, and it's such a rich allegory and metaphor for various kind of forces. And it's so adaptable then, because ultimately it's all about how we are confronted as people with an unstoppable force, right? Whether that is the nuclear kind of Armageddon, really, of the original, or whether that is the kind of satirical side, the horror side in Shin Godzilla, or even now, this idea of Godzilla as kind of a response to what humanity has done to the natural world in the Legendary series. Godzilla is such a rich character in terms of what it can do and what it can represent, that I think it leaves individual artists with so much room to kind of have some fun with it and play with it in a way that kind of suits their personal vision.
Yeah, that was very well said. That was way better than I would have been able to put it. You should write about this sort of thing, you know? No, what we talked about Godzilla versus Kong already in 2021. It was weird times,
Yeah.
that we were still coming out of the pandemic. That was actually one of the first movies that, I mean, I think they had a really good response considering it was a pandemic movie to that movie, which is why we even get this sequel. But then watching Godzilla X Kong, I realized how much of Godzilla versus Kong I had forgotten. Did you find that at all?
I actually made sure to rewatch all of those movies ahead of time to kind of get myself in the mood. And yeah, it kind of like made me reconsider some things about, how the MonsterVerse is coming along and some of the storylines, and it made me appreciate some things more as well. It made me appreciate rewatching Godzilla versus Kong, really made me appreciate one, the King Kong side of things a lot more, and number two, how silly and fun it was as a movie. You have like obviously, it had completely gone over my head that the guy running Mechagodzilla is obviously meant to be Serizawa's son from the first two films, and I found it really fun and really silly that his main motivation is my dad loved Godzilla more than he loved me. um, and that had gone completely over my head in cinema. So I was delighted to see that because I found that hilarious.
I need to rewatch Godzilla versus Kong. Yeah, see, there's like a lot of, but I'm sure there's a bunch of things that because it was a pandemic movie. It was one. I think it was
Yeah.
one of the ones that HBO released or that Warner Brothers released on HBO Max. So I watched it
Yeah,
at
it was like
home.
same day, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And but this one, I obviously watched it in theaters. I watched it in 3D as well, just because it was there. I was like, why not? And it's definitely made for that. The sound design, just seeing it on the biggest screen possible. I thought that was
Mhm.
pretty good. The 3D conversion, just while I'm on the 3D aspect of it,
Yeah.
could have been a little bit better. You could definitely tell they didn't
Okay.
really have 3D in mind when they were shooting
Yeah.
it. because I think 3D is kind of a thing of the past at this point. We're kind of moving past it, so I feel like a lot of filmmakers don't think about it. So that could
Yeah,
have been better.
I always think about that with 3D as well, right? Like I always try and look up whether a film has been explicitly made with 3D in mind before I see it in 3D. So something like Avatar, for example, is
Right.
kind of made with that explicitly in mind as like a medium, like a choice. And so I'll always make an effort to see that in 3D. But yeah, I was going to ask actually how the 3D conversion was, but I'm kind of glad I didn't spend the extra $5 on that then, I guess.
There's some movies that you see, like you said, like Avatar. Yeah, I didn't see the first Avatar in 3D. I should have. So when the second one came around, I definitely saw it in 3D. But a lot of movies, if you just see it in like IMAX, the Dolby, that's it's worth it, the upgrade for that instead of the 3D.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. I saw GXK in IMAX actually, and I'm pleased that, we forked out the extra money for that.
Yeah, I saw Godzilla minus one in IMAX, and that was good. I'm curious how they
Oh,
released it in black and white. I'm curious how that was too. I'm always
yeah, I'd love to see that version as well, actually. Yeah, that sounds like a really interesting choice.
But it seems like whether it's IMAX 3D, a lot of people seem to be going to see this Godzilla X, both the Godzilla versus Kong, and then now that we're out of the pandemic at the movies, Godzilla X Kong. I haven't looked at the exact numbers, but it seems like it's going to have a really good opening weekend.
Yeah, I was seeing something this morning, something about like 180 odd million worldwide, or like I think it was saying it's even beat June Part 2 in terms of opening weekend,
Yeah,
uh, which feels kind of massive for a Godzilla movie in particular.
that's crazy. I mean, it's. I guess I haven't really gotten into my thoughts about it. We'll kind of go more into the thoughts as we go along. So I'm not quite sure about how I feel about it being Dune, because Dune might just be a better movie.
Oh God, yeah. No, there's no question about that. Yeah, June's a
Okay.
better film.
There we go. Don't have to pump the brakes on that at all. Okay. But you did mention one of the positives about this is there's a lot of characterization for Kong in this movie. I loved
Yeah.
that. I didn't realize I did
Uh,
again. I can't remember very much about the previous films. I'm horrible about this, but I felt like this had the most character. Like Kong's like the main character in this movie. I thought that was really
oh,
exciting.
yeah, yeah. And I thought that was really lovely what they did with his character. I mean, like one of my main things, even in the lead up to it, just watching the trailers and the kind of clips they released in advance, was how much expression, how much human expression they were giving to Kong in particular, to kind of ensure that the audience can like fully empathize with him as a character. I think, I mean, obviously, as it sounds rather silly, really, when you say like as an ape, of course, we can then relate a little bit more to Kong than a giant lizard. But I think
That's
it's
fair
true in
though.
a sense. Yeah. And I think, there's always been something quite relatable about Kong as a character, like even in the 1930s, right? He's always this character who's always looking for like a place to belong or like looking for some kind of connection. And I thought it was really lovely how the film kind of picked up on that and ran with it, really.
That is interesting. I hadn't thought about how that connects to his original going back to his original appearance in the 30s. Yeah, how he's always kind of been portrayed in like a yeah, like a under misunderstood kind of character. And that's kind of
Yeah, yeah.
interesting.
He's always been very tragic,
Yeah.
has Kong.
Well,
Yeah, and it's nice to see him be like a full-on action hero, but with a great big heart.
at the beginning of this movie, I didn't know though how they were portraying Godzilla exactly because they introduced Godzilla and it's like it seems like because Kong at the beginning of the film is down in the
Yeah.
Hollow Earth, Godzilla's still on the surface, but he's almost like going and attacking the bad Titans for like
Mm.
humans a little bit. So I'm like, is he being portrayed as a hero? But then later in the movie, whenever he's on the way to go charge up for the big battle, he's knocking down cities. It feels more like the Godzilla minus one, the Toho Godzilla. So like, how did you feel about that? Like, it seems like in some scenes they're going for Godzilla as a hero, in some scenes they're going for he's just a he's a villain kind of thing. How did you feel about that?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to what I wrote about a few years ago, is that Godzilla's neither a villain nor a hero, right? He's just this force and he's unstoppable. And sometimes that's to humanity's benefit, but ultimately he's not about humanity. I mean, they say in the movie itself that Kong is the protector of humanity, or like the apes are the protectors, and then you've got Godzilla to kind of preserve a wider balance. And of course, humanity is part of that, but it's not necessarily the focus of it. So I thought that was quite an interesting choice to kind of play Godzilla as being rather apathetic towards humans. And I think that is in line, like historically, with his characterization in the Toho films.
Yeah, he is a force of nature. That's well said.
Mm,
The next note I have is shitty human characters. One thing you haven't seen -1,
yeah,
but one thing I like about -1, and it's something that I like Shin Godzilla a lot, but even Shin Godzilla kind of fails at making the human characters interesting. -1 is able to do that finally in a Godzilla
yeah.
movie. This movie leans a little bit more into just making the monsters the main characters, which I appreciate, but you still have the human characters in this film, and they are the American movies just haven't quite nailed them yet. The way I have it written down is you got podcast conspiracy guy, you got Rebecca Hall and Dan Stevens, you got and the perfect child who is the key to everything, which is kind of a
Mm.
trope. You see that trope a lot nowadays, so it's a little like tiresome. I felt like here.
Yeah, I mean, also you kind of do see that trope of like the perfect mystical child
Yeah.
across the Toho films as well, right?
Yeah.
Like that's another thing that I was doing is I was before the film I ended up rewatching or watching for the first time, like trying to fill in any gaps that I had because of course I haven't seen every single Godzilla film,
Sure.
but I was trying to fill in as many of the gaps as I possibly could in advance. And yeah, that is like a recurrent thing of these mystical, magical children who have this like connection with these giant kaiju or giant monsters. So I mean, I actually think that the little girl, comparatively to the other human characters, was kind of the least annoying of the humans, I
Fair.
suppose.
Fair.
Um, also because I quite appreciate, the Kaylee Hottle, I believe, is the one who played her. I appreciate her performance. I think having her communicate through sign language, I think that's an awesome choice, and it like really makes her a very distinct character. It makes her stand out from the crowd. Whereas, for example, Dan Stevens, God love him, very handsome, very charismatic man, you kind of roll your eyes whenever he's on screen in this film.
Yeah.
So, as much as like he's clearly having a blast with it, and I'm delighted for him,
Right.
but he does annoy a little bit in this film, and yeah, same with Brian Tyree Henry as well. I feel like,
That's exactly what I was
um,
gonna say. I feel like you could cut Dan Stevens and podcast guy from the movie, unfortunately, and it would have been
yeah, yeah.
better.
Who
Oh
can
well,
say? Who
who
can
can
say? It
say?
would certainly give us an extra 5 minutes, I suppose.
If you're gonna lean into Godzilla and Kong are the main characters, let's go all the way with it. Like we're all
Right. Yeah.
there. And maybe the next 2 movies from now we'll have it where there's just no no dialogue. It's just all
It's
grunting at each other.
entirely like creatures punching each other in the face, which I personally would be delighted with.
Oh, speaking of which, we do have Evil Kong and Ice Godzilla in this movie. I
Mm,
thought that was it was kind of going the Marvel like phase 1, phase 2 route where the villain is just like an evil version of the hero. I thought it was kind of fun though. By the time we got to the point where we had that hero shot of them all jumping in the air at each other, I was like, this movie is so
wonderful.
ridiculous and I love
Wonderful.
it.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I'm a huge fan of like that kind of, yeah, exactly as you said, like Marvel phase 1, phase 2, where like you had these villains who were um like inversions of the heroes, right? I always find that really interesting and like really revealing about who the characters are and like how they distinguish themselves then from the villains. So, I'm cool with that. I loved the addition of Shimo just because I think she had a really fun design. She had cool powers. And she was adorable at the end. So
There's a lot of destruction in the movie, and it's kind of hard to grasp the scale of it at times. It's
oh
it's amazing,
yeah.
but also it's like there was one that was I don't. I just it was noticeable. I would have cut it if I was, because there's one moment where Godzilla is in the water and
Mm.
he's got his dorsal fins out. He's kind of going like a shark, and he just he rams right into a bridge, and the bridge just collapses, and it looks very eerie. In America, we just had a giant
Oh,
tragedy.
yeah.
There's one thing I'm just like, if I was an editor and I had the time,
I
I would
had
cut
that
that.
exact same thought. I had that exact same thought when I was sitting in the cinema. Like, this scene would have played very differently if this had come out 2 weeks ago.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, very, very differently. Yeah, it was pretty striking. I mean, I guess in some ways you could argue then, that is as well kind of forwarding this idea of Godzilla is still this destructive force, right? Um, yeah, he's not caring about the damage that he causes.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, I mean, humans, they're what? They're ants,
Yeah. And his,
comparatively.
yeah. Yeah. I want to know what Adam Wingard has to say about it. Would he cut it, or
Yeah,
would he lean into it?
I'd be interested to see if they had conversations about that over the last week or so. Yeah.
There's a Mothra in this film. Wasn't she dead in King of the Monsters? Didn't Mothra die? You said you watched him recently, right? Do you know what happened? Is Mothra still alive? Did they retcon
Yeah.
that? What's going on?
Okay, so I do have the law on this one.
Okay.
So Mothra did die in King of the Monsters. However, as the end credits reveal, because they have those fun end credits, which is like
Right.
social media posts, newspaper clippings about the Titans and that kind of thing. It reveals that Mothra managed to lay an egg before going out into battle. And according to Michael Dougherty, who was the director of King of the Monsters, he spoke about this and said that Mothra's DNA and memories are genetically passed down to her offspring. So
Okay.
Mothra is de facto immortal. Um,
Okay.
I mean, Mothra's always been a bit of more on the fantasy side of kaiju monsters. She's always had like that mystical element to her. Um, and I think it's interesting to play that up and all of that. But I think it is interesting how the extent to which that may or may not clash with some of their attempts to lean more into the sci-fi side in the legendary films. Although I do think that this film in particular, with the amount of time spent in the Hollow Earth, with Shimo, that ice crystal on the Scar King's
Yeah,
whip thing, they were very much leaning more
for
heavily
sure.
into the fantasy kind of mystical side of things.
And that's definitely a route they've chosen, which you said, again, watching them recently, it must be kind of crazy to go from like 2014, it's like our world, and Godzilla invades, and now it's definitely like it feels like the Marvel Cinematic Universe a little bit. So
Yeah,
it's
I
gotta
mean,
be interesting.
it feels much more cartoony as well than Marvel. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I guess one of my gripes with the MCU is rather that um, there's this hesitation to go all the way into goofiness and hesitation to kind of lean into those comic book vibes a lot of the time. Whereas, for better or for worse, the Monsterverse, they've decided we're going to lean into it. We're going to go all the way. And you've got to respect that level of commitment.
I guess I appreciate that we live in a world where, because I guess my personal preference is
Mm,
this movie, as far as saying whether I recommend this movie, it's a fun time. I had a lot, it's a great theater experience. I think people will have a lot of fun with it. My audience seemed to be having a lot of fun with it. But in terms of which is a better movie, Godzilla Minus One, Shin Godzilla, that approach, the Toho approach of taking it a little bit more seriously, I think is more for me. But I love that we live in the world where we get both, which isn't that kind of, that's kind of great.
yeah, exactly. Again, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, right? About the kind of range of possibilities within this character and what he can mean. I think it's awesome that you can have both practically simultaneously. And also, I think it's worth bearing in mind, obviously, it's not like Toho hasn't leaned into the silliness of Godzilla throughout its time,
We all
right?
go they all go through phases, it feels like.
Exactly, exactly. Godzilla, he's in his silly little guy phase. Um,
Um, Speaking of which, real quickly, we have a bunch of other cool Titan designs I loved. I love the underwater nuclear dragon. I thought that was great. The water serpent the underwater nuclear dragon is the one that Godzilla fights, and then the water serpent, I believe, is the one that Kong fights towards the maybe the
yeah.
beginning of the movie. And that was kind of fun. They got Baby Kong in this movie. Felt a little bit marketing. I could feel the marketing team being like, man, you know, that Baby Yoda is really selling well. You know what we could use? But I loved him nonetheless. You know. Uh,
Yeah, yeah. I was particularly delighted when Kong kind of picked him up like a baseball bat and started whacking him around. I thought that was hilarious.
I was like, is he gonna kill him at this point? Because like you can't tell like the how elastic these characters are. Like you could kill him or they could easily just brush it off. I have no idea.
Exactly.
It's hilarious. Lots of product placement. Got Cheetos, got Volkswagen, got Sony. I watched Ghostbusters Frozen Empire last weekend, and the Sony Ghostbusters movies are just riddled with product placement. So now I'm like, my mind, I feel like, is just super focused on it. So shout out to Cheetos for sponsoring Godzilla X Kong.
Yeah, yeah. That extra money, it clearly paid off in some of that CG.
There we
So,
go. Yeah, and I was thinking about that, like the budget difference. Like -1 had like a
mm,
less than 20 million US dollars. This one probably had, I'm just guessing, like in probably over 100 million, probably closer to 150, if not 200 million. But they had so much more in terms of monster design. So I'm just like in awe of probably how much work that all took.
yeah, yeah. I mean, the fact that Godzilla minus one's budget was so low, and yet, obviously I've seen clips and stuff, even if I haven't seen the full film, it's mind blowing.
Yeah.
It's mind blowing that they made it look that good. Um, I think it's fascinating that they can do that. As for GXK, my understanding is the budget was around 130 or something.
Okay.
Um, I think I was reading that this morning. So yeah, kind of on the relatively lower end of massive blockbuster
Yes.
budgets right now, which in itself says a lot, I think, because, obviously it's a hugely expensive film. But you do have this gorgeous CG throughout the film, where you have like this real, like I was saying, the sense of texture, the sense of expression on these monster characters. But yeah, it is remarkable how huge some of these budgets are.
I guess the last thing I have, and thank you again so much for joining the show. It's been a pleasure talking to you again and catching up about all things Godzilla and Kong and the MonsterVerse. But the last thing I have is final thoughts. Yeah, kind of what are your final thoughts on Godzilla X Kong? I think it's safe to say that we would probably both recommend it. It's a fun theater experience, but I'd like to hear what you have to think and like what's next. What would you like to see next? What do you think will happen next? Final thoughts on
Yeah,
what's next.
yeah. I mean, I would say one of the highlights of the film for me was the Egypt fight, just because there were so many, again, great character moments for Godzilla and Kong. My particular favorite moment that got a huge laugh in my theater was Kong dragging Godzilla by the tail towards the portal. I thought that was hilarious and wonderful. Godzilla in this film is so undignified, and again, kind of going back to what we were talking about before, I think that's wonderful in comparison to -1 as well. Yeah, I think in terms of what's next, though, I feel like they are kind of laying the groundwork for more of a story where humanity takes a larger role, perhaps, in the Hollow Earth. Um, it's something that I noticed with a couple of the lines throughout the film about how humanity is encroaching more and more into the Hollow Earth, and yet it's relatively unexplored. I think there's a lot of material there
Yeah.
to be mined. In terms of kaiju that I personally would love to see, I mean, having recently watched Godzilla versus Hedorah recently for the first time, I kind of I think I'd love to see Hedorah in these films. I think there's an opportunity to do something really cool and spooky with the character and really gross.
Yeah.
And I think again that kind of like textured, gross out vibe of a giant smog monster could end up being really fun in this sort of setting.
Perfect. Well, Hannah Searson, again, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure. I would always recommend it. I'll link in the description of this video your article, Force of Nature, What Godzilla Really Means. You're also a very fun follow on Twitter. Is there anything else that, any of your work that you want to point people to before I let you go?
No, other than that, yeah, just give me a shout on Twitter if anybody ever wants to talk about giant monsters punching each other in the face.
Hannah Searson, thank you so much.
All right, thanks, Sam.
All right, that's our show. I'd like to thank Hannah Searson for joining us this week. Next week, John Leon will be here to talk to us about Rebel Moon Part 1. Make sure you follow us here on YouTube. We're also on Apple and Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow the Film Fan Club on TikTok and Facebook at the Film Fan Club. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Samuel D. Carrico. Of course, I've been Sam Carrico. Thanks so much. I'll see you next week.